Good morning, everybody. I hope you all are doing well. I am back again with another installment of our arrow testing series. And before I get started here, I just want to mention that if you guys like this video, if you're enjoying watching this series, please make sure you're liking it and subscribing. These videos took a lot of effort to make, so your support is much appreciated. Another thing, if you have not been following along, make sure you click right up here and go check out the other videos in this series. This is a whole series, and I'm hoping that you guys are learning a lot from it because I know that I definitely learned a lot from all of this testing. For those of you just tuning in with us here, I'll give you a little bit of background. All of this started with a little bit of curiosity for me on different arrow weights at different poundages and how they reacted in my bow. And what this led to is this graph right here. Now this graph is an arrow weight versus velocity graph out of my bow at two different poundages. With this, I was able to take it and put it into Archer's Advantage and get all of the downrange information. And this downrange information allowed me to do a bunch of different calculations, which leads us to where we are today and to this video. What I'm going to cover today is the effects of arrow spine on velocity out of your bow. But first I'm going to start by defining what the arrow spine is. Generally, there's two different types of arrow spine that people refer to. There's static spine and there's dynamic spine. Static spine is measured using a spine tester similar to the RAM spine tester, which I used in this video, and it's the more common one on the market. But this is the flex of the arrow when a 1.94 pound weight is applied to a 29-inch arrow that is being supported at 28 inches. And once this weight is applied, the deflection of the arrow is measured from a zero. The static spine is generally what you see on your arrow. So if you're buying 250 spine arrows, that is a measurement of the static spine. Dynamic spine is not so measurable, but how the arrow reacts when it is shot out of your bow. So whether the arrow flexes up, flexes left, flexes right, or down, and how much it flexes when it is shot. This is a result of the static spine and the spine location. Some other factors that play into this are FOC, arrow weight, arrow velocity, and of course, like I said, the orientation of the spine with respect to your strain. So a common practice to hopefully eliminate the effects of dynamic spine from arrow to arrow would be to paper tune each arrow. This is going to allow you to knock tune each arrow so that the dynamic spine between each arrow is performing about as close as you can get them to perform. So in order to begin this testing, I used a RAM spine tester and I grabbed a handful of arrows and I threw them on there and started measuring the spine. Now my arrows are cut to 28 and 13/16 shaft length, so it's not exactly the 29-inch standard, but I was still using the 28-inch supports. So the spine measurements you see from my arrows might not exactly match the spines that are on the labels. Once I gathered the spine data from the RAM spine tester, I took these arrows and I made sure that the weights were as close as possible so that I could begin my velocity testing. At this point, I also want to mention a previous video, and if you haven't watched the previous videos, click up here and watch this one. This previous video talked about arrow weight variation on velocity. In this video, I took the exact same arrow, added some weight, took away some weight, and had an intermediate weight, so I had a total variation of 12 grains. And in this 12 grains, the intermediate variation was 6 grains. Through the testing, I found that 6 grains only equated to 1.5 feet per second on the velocity coming out of the bow. And out to 100 yards, this variation only came out to be about 2 inches on target. So this table shows the arrows I was working with today. These arrows only had a spread of 2.4 grains. And with these 2.4 grains, I saw a muzzle velocity spread of 3.6 feet per second. I'm attributing this spread to arrow spine. I believe that all three of these arrows have enough of a different arrow spine that we are seeing different muzzle velocities. You can see that this group of arrows had an overall spine spread of about 20 thousandths of an inch. None of these arrows had more than a 6/1000th inch of variance between their min and max measurements. In this table, I also want to note that the smaller the number, the stiffer the spine. So that means that the 0.194 number is deflecting less under a 1.94 pound load than a 0.214. Something I'd like to point out in this table are arrow tests 1 and 2. These tests had an arrow weight variation of 0.03 grains, but they had a velocity variation of 3.6 feet per second. Now this velocity variation is due to the spine. If you look at the spines, arrow number 1 was my stiffest spine. And if you look at the spine of arrow number 2, it was my weakest spine. Another thing I would like to point out is if you look at tests 3 and 4. Tests 3 and 4 had a weight variation of 2.4 grains. These two arrows only had a muzzle velocity difference of 1.4 feet per second. Now, if you completely forget about my last video, talking about muzzle velocity and arrow weight variation, this does not add up to what arrow tests 1 and 2 showed us. You would think that this arrow weight variation would cause more of a velocity spread than it actually does. But taking into account my last video, this is showing that arrow spine plays a very large role in what your muzzle velocity actually is. The spine measurements of these two arrows are significantly closer than the spine measurements of arrow tests 1 and 2, so you are seeing less of a velocity spread between these two. So this also led me to wonder if spine location played a role in muzzle velocity. So what did I do? I grabbed my trusty arrow that I've been using for all my other testing, measured it on the spine tester, and I shot it at different orientations. So for this arrow, the spine measured at 180 degrees from vein 3. So that means that the spine was located on the very bottom when my vein number 3 was used as my cock vein. And what I did to test this was I put vein number 3 up and I shot it through the chronograph, rotated to vein number 2, shot it through the chronograph, and then rotated to vein number 1 and shot it through the chronograph. And this table shows what I found. I found that placing this arrow in those 3 different orientations gave me a muzzle velocity spread of about 0.5 feet per second. Now, yes, it showed a spread. No, I'm not convinced that this spread means that there's a muzzle velocity difference between the spine orientation. Half a foot per second could definitely be a chronograph error. But for the sake of this testing, I will just assume that 0.5 feet per second of these variations comes from spine orientation. But before I get into the downrange ballistics of the 4 arrows I tested for spine, I do want to show this table that shows the downrange arrow drop of the arrow that I tested for spine orientation. So this arrow had a velocity spread coming out of my bow of 0.5 feet per second. This equated to a 0.10 inch difference at 20 yards, and out to 100 yards, it only equated to a 0.8 inch difference on the target. So this 0.5 feet per second is a very minuscule difference in muzzle velocity and downrange ballistics. Now I'd like to move on to this table. This table shows those 4 arrows that I tested for spine, their muzzle velocity, and their terminal velocity at different yardages. You can see that out to 80 yards and onto 100, these arrows have a terminal speed variation of 3.3 feet per second. And with this speed, you can also calculate the momentum difference, which can be seen in this table. Now these 4 arrows only have a momentum difference of about 7 thousandths of a slug foot per second at all of these yardages out to 150, which is 6,000 slug feet per second. As I've said in the past, what this means, I can't tell you right now. Hopefully I'll be able to tell you in the future. What the terminal speed chart gives me the ability to do is find that total arrow drop at different yardages, which is where this starts to get interesting. In this table, you can see that at 20 yards, there's a 0.2 inch difference between these 4 arrows. At 60, there's almost a 2 inch difference. At 80, about a 3.5 inch difference on target. And at 100, about a 5.5 inch difference on target. And remember that the 2 arrows driving this spread are the 2 arrows that are actually the closest in arrow weight. So this table shows what you would see on a sight tape if you were adjusting for the velocity difference between these 4 arrows. You can see that at 20 yards, there's almost no adjustment. But once you get out to 60 yards, you need almost a 20 thousandths of adjustment. And at 80, almost a 30 thousandths. And at 100, almost 40 thousandths of adjustment on your sight tape for all of these arrows to hit in the same spot. So another way to look at this could be how the muzzle velocity variation equates to the number of inches of deer drop, which I've been doing in previous videos. And that's this table right here. You can see that at 20 yards, it equates to about 0.3 inches difference in deer drop. And out to 100, almost 1.4 inches of deer drop. But one thing to note is that this deer drop number may seem small. But you also have to add your arrow drop totals into this. Because if you're shooting your max and your min, you're not only going to see this deer drop difference, you're also going to see the arrow drop difference between those 2 arrows. Once you add in your total arrow drop, you get these numbers. And with these numbers, you can see that out to 80 yards, this equates to a 4.5 inch difference in where your arrow is going to hit on that deer. With all of this information, I want to ask the question, do you need to pay more attention to arrow spine? I can't answer that for you. All I can do is give my opinions and answer it for myself. What I did here was present the data, and I encourage you to review this data and decide for yourself. Now, it's not going to be exactly with your bow, but it will be somewhat close. One thing I recommend doing is looking at your arrow total drop and the deer drop and deciding if that arrow impact location is acceptable for you when you're in the woods. So for me, looking at 60 yards, there's a 2.7 inch difference in arrow impact location when I include arrow drop total and deer drop total. Now, is this 2.7 inches a problem for me? I don't know when it comes to a 60-yard shot, but at 40 yards, a 1.3 inch difference for me, I'm not worried about a 1.3 inch difference. I definitely still need to do some more testing to determine whether or not these variations are a problem for me. But I do think that when it comes to the target world, these variations are a big problem. These could very much mean the difference in winning a tournament or coming in second or third. Going forward, I don't think spine indexing, spine tuning is necessarily as easy as paper tuning arrows. I think a RAM spine tester can tell you a lot, but those are expensive. And a tool that more people probably have than a RAM spine tester would be a chronograph. I think a chronograph can tell you a lot about an arrow based off of what I found here. Shooting all your arrows over a chronograph is going to give you your min and your max velocities. And once you have that, you can also find your average velocities. And once you have your average velocity, you can start to narrow down what your window spread is. Now, that is taking your mins and your maxes and getting rid of them. Because like I showed in this last video, if all your arrows are within a 6 grain spread, you're only going to see about 1 foot per second to 1.5 foot per second of muzzle velocity difference. But if you have a large range of spines in that batch of arrows, you could see almost a 4 foot per second difference. And in the target world, I think this 4 foot per second difference matters. In the hunting world, it's still up in the air for me. My initial thought is that it doesn't make that much of a difference, but it depends what yardages you're shooting at. All right, I see my memory card flashing on my camera, so I'm gonna wrap this up. If you guys like this video, make sure you're liking and subscribing. These videos took a lot of work, so we appreciate your support. Comment down below if there's other videos that you guys wanna see, and make sure you guys are following along. If you haven't watched previous videos, click up here, check out those previous videos, and keep an eye out for future videos. All right, guys, have a great day, and get out, shoot your bow. See ya.